In the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, there is a clay prism, four-sided, 20 centimeters tall, covered on every surface in cuneiform script. Purchased by Herbert Weld Blundell in 1922 from an antique dealer in Baghdad. Donated to the museum, catalogued, photographed, put in a case, and it has been there ever since. The prism is called the Weld Blundell Prism, catalog number 1923.444, and it contains the single most inconvenient document in the history of human archaeology, the Sumerian king list, a complete record of every ruler of ancient Sumer from the beginning of kingship to the time the prism was written. The first section of the list covers 8 kings who ruled before the Great Flood, their names, their cities, their reigns. And their reigns are the problem.
The first king, Ululim of Eridu, ruled for 28,800 years. The second king, Alalgar, also of Eridu, ruled for 36,000 years. The shortest reign in the pre-flood section is 18,600 years. The longest is 43,200 years. 8 kings, a combined total of 241,200 years of rule. Mainstream scholars call this mythology. They say the scribes were exaggerating to legitimize later dynasties, that the numbers are symbolic, that no one took them literally. But here is what mainstream scholars do not mention. The scribes who wrote this list also wrote astronomical calculations accurate to fractions of a degree, tax records, trade agreements, medical procedures. They did not exaggerate those. They did not use symbolic numbers for grain shipments. They recorded what they knew to be true. And they recorded 8 kings who ruled for tens of thousands of years each.
If you want to understand what that actually means and where those 8 kings are buried, subscribe. I cover the documents mainstream archaeology has decided not to discuss. Now, let's go into what the prism actually says. The Sumerian king list is not a fringe document. It is one of the most studied texts in ancient Near Eastern scholarship. Over 20 separate copies have been found across multiple sites: Nippur, Larsa, Kish, Isin, Susa, and every major Mesopotamian city kept a copy. The standard scholarly interpretation is this: the pre-flood section, with its impossibly long reigns, is mythological. The post-flood section, with normal human lifespans, is historical. The flood is the dividing line between legend and fact. After the flood, the list reads completely differently. The first post-flood king of Kish ruled for 1,200 years, then 960, then 900. The numbers drop rapidly across generations until they reach normal human spans, and scholars say the transition proves the pre-flood numbers are myth. But that argument collapses when you look at one detail they never mention. The scribes drew no distinction between the two sections. They used identical formatting, identical language, identical administrative structure, the same phrase, the same verb forms, the same record-keeping conventions. And if the pre-flood section was mythology and the post-flood section was history, the scribes who wrote it gave no indication they understood that difference. They wrote it all as one continuous administrative record, a record of rulers in order with their reigns. The Babylonian priest Berossus, writing around 280 BCE, gave his own version of the king list to Greek audiences. He listed 10 pre-flood kings. His shortest reign was 18,600 years. His longest was 64,800 years. And he was writing for Greeks who had no religious reason to accept these numbers. He wrote them anyway, because in his tradition, these were historical facts, not metaphors, not symbols, facts. The prism also gives something most summaries leave out. It gives the cities, and each pre-flood king is listed with a specific city of origin. 5 cities are named: Eridu,
Bod Tabira, Larak, Sippar, Shuruppak. And these are not mythological places. Every single one of them has been excavated. Every single one of them exists in the archaeological record.
Eridu is confirmed as the oldest city in Mesopotamia. Its archaeological layers go down to approximately 5400 BCE, but the site shows continuous occupation going back much further than that, and the deeper layers have not been fully excavated. Bad Tabira, Larak, Sippar, Shuruppak, all real, all excavated, all showing occupation sequences that extend further back than mainstream chronology is comfortable with. The king list places these cities as existing before the flood, and the flood in Mesopotamian chronology is placed around 2900 BCE, based on a distinct sediment layer found across multiple sites in southern Iraq. But the cities the king list names as pre-flood were already ancient by 2900 BCE. Eridu's deepest excavated layers predate that flood layer by at least 2,500 years. The scribes were not inventing these cities. They were naming real places, and they were naming real kings who ruled those real places for impossibly long periods of time. Now here is where it gets specific. The king list names the 8 pre-flood kings individually: Alulim, Alalgar, Enmen-Luana, Enmen-Galana, Dumuzid, Ensipad-Zid-Ana, Enmen-Dur-Ana, Ubara-Tutu. And these are not generic titles. These are names, specific individual names, and they appear in other Sumerian texts. Dumuzid appears in the mythology as a shepherd king who descends to the underworld. He has a story, a history, relationships with other named figures. And Enmen-Dur-Ana appears in a separate Babylonian text as the king of Sippar who was taken up to heaven by the gods and taught the arts of divination before being returned to earth to teach humanity. That text is on a tablet in the British Museum. The parallel with the biblical Enoch, who walked with God and was taken, was identified by scholar W.G. Lambert in 1967 and has not been seriously challenged since. The 7th pre-flood king of Sumer and the 7th patriarch of Genesis are the same figure. Different names, identical story, identical position in the sequence. The question mainstream scholarship refuses to ask is not whether those reigns are accurate as written. The question is what the scribes were actually measuring. A Sumerian year was not necessarily our year. The base 60 mathematical system had specific sacred numbers, 3600 and 36,000. And the number 3600 in Sumerian was called a sar, representing one complete cycle. If the scribes were recording reigns in sars rather than years, then the longest reign of 43,200 years becomes 12 sars, a number with specific astronomical significance. But the sar conversion does not fully explain the numbers, and what the scribes were measuring has never been satisfactorily answered. Now, here is the part that no mainstream paper discusses. The king list does not say the pre-flood kings died. It says kingship was transferred. The Sumerian phrase is Nam Lugal Bade. Kingship was carried away, or kingship departed. Not the king died. Not the king was buried. Kingship departed. For the post-flood kings, the text uses a different construction. Kings are said to have been smitten by weapons, to have gone to their fates, to have been buried in specific locations. But the pre-flood kings have none of this. They ruled, then kingship departed, then the next city received kingship. Other Sumerian texts provide partial answers. Dumuzid, the pre-flood king, descends to the underworld, the Kur, and remains there. Enmen-Dur-Ana is taken to heaven by the gods before the flood and returned. And a text called The Death of Gilgamesh describes the burial of a post-flood king who claims divine ancestry, in the bed of the Euphrates River after the water was temporarily diverted, his grave goods listed in detail. The river returned to its course over him. If a post-flood king of claimed partial divine ancestry was buried under a diverted river, what happened to the pre-flood kings themselves? In 2003, during the early days of the Iraq War, a team from the Oriental Institute attempted to reach the site of ancient Eridu in southern Iraq. The site had not been fully excavated since the 1940s, and the team was turned back by military operations before reaching the site. A 2018 satellite survey of the Eridu region, using ground-penetrating radar, detected a series of subsurface anomalies at depths between 15 and 40 meters below the current ground surface. The anomalies are rectangular, arranged in a pattern inconsistent with natural geological formation, noted in the published report as requiring further investigation, and that investigation has not been conducted. The site remains difficult to access due to ongoing regional instability. Now, here is where the king list intersects with something the scribes could not have known we would discover. In 2013, a team at Harvard Medical School, led by Dr. David Reich, published a comprehensive study of ancient DNA from Mesopotamian burial sites, looking at population movement and admixture across the ancient Near East. What the team found in samples from southern Mesopotamian sites, dated between 6000 and 3000 BCE, was unexpected. Certain individuals buried with markers of high status, temple associations, elaborate grave goods, architectural burial chambers, showed a distinct genetic profile, not dramatically different from the general population, but statistically distinct in specific ways. Higher frequency of certain variants associated with cognitive function, different distributions of markers associated with metabolic rate, and in 3 individuals from Eridu itself, the oldest confirmed city in Mesopotamia, anomalous mitochondrial sequences that did not match any population in the existing reference database. The study notes these anomalies in a footnote, saying the sequences may represent lineages that have since disappeared from the modern gene pool. It recommends further sampling from early Mesopotamian elite burial contexts, and that sampling has not been published.
The king list describes 8 individuals who ruled before the flood, gives them names, cities, reigns that no standard human biology can account for. And the genetic data from those same cities shows anomalous profiles in high-status burials. The simplest connection between those two facts is not the one mainstream scholarship is prepared to make. So what are we actually looking at? 3 possibilities.
The first, the pre-flood section, is pure mythology. The scribes invented impossibly long reigns to legitimize their civilization. The cities are real, but the kings are fictional. The genetic anomalies are statistical noise. And this is the mainstream position. But it requires accepting that the same scribes who recorded accurate astronomical data and precise economic records invented an elaborate fictional prehistory in exactly the same format as their verified historical records. It requires accepting that Berosus presented these fictional numbers to a Greek audience that had no reason to accept them. And it requires accepting that multiple independent ancient traditions, Sumerian, Babylonian, Hebrew, all independently invented the same structure of extraordinarily long pre-flood lifespans with no common source.
The second possibility. The numbers are real, but measure something other than solar years, a different unit of time, a different counting system. But this has never produced a consistent decoding that works across all 8 kings and their reigns. The third possibility. The numbers are accurate as written. The beings who held kingship before the flood were not biologically identical to post-flood humans. Something changed at the flood, and the king list itself supports this reading. The scribes did not present it as mythology becoming history. They presented it as one continuous administrative record with a single dividing event, the flood. Before the flood, one kind of ruler, one kind of lifespan. After the flood, another kind, normal human spans. A factual transition from one era to another, not a literary device. The Weld-Blundell prism sits in a case in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. You can see it on display. It is not restricted. It is not hidden. It is simply not explained.
The museum label describes it as a Sumerian king list with legendary pre-flood rulers, and the word legendary does all the work. It is the institutional response to a document that does not fit the timeline. Label it legend, move past it. Do not ask what the scribes were recording. But the scribes were not writing legends. They were writing administration. The same scribes, the same format, the same conventions. 8 kings, 5 real cities, 241,200 years of documented rule, and a flood that ended it. After which human lifespans dropped from tens of thousands of years to hundreds, then to decades. After which the gods, according to the texts, withdrew. After which the knowledge of what came before was gradually lost, until only the king list remained.
A receipt, as one researcher put it. Not a warning, not a prophecy. A receipt for a world that existed before this one. Written by people who knew it had existed, who wanted the record to survive, who pressed it into clay, because clay lasts. The prism is still in Oxford. The anomalies at Eridu are still unmapped. The genetic sequences from the elite Mesopotamian burials are still unexplained. And the king list still says what it has always said. 8 kings, before the flood, reigning for what the scribes recorded as tens of thousands of years each. And the simplest question is also the one no institution will ask. What were they?
Subscribe, because next week I am covering the Death of Gilgamesh text, the tablet that describes exactly where the post-flood king who claimed descent from these pre-flood rulers was buried. The location is specific, the burial was witnessed, and a 2019 satellite survey found a subsurface anomaly at exactly those coordinates. The video is on screen. Click it. I'll see you in the next one.